What is up, my legions of 2 or 3 YouTube followers? Here is the latest update on the Gibson GA-6. Things are going slowly, I have to admit. I'm still waiting on the transformers. And, you know, I realize that I'm saying transformers plural because we need the output transformer, which, as we covered in an earlier episode, is got some completely baked windings on it. And even though I thought the power transformer was good on this amp, I'm digging around the bench looking for it so I can show. Oh, there it is. It's on the other bench. I cut it open too, and it's got some corrosion issues there, but besides that, it's got open windings. So it's no good either. So I had to order both the power and output transformer. So now you're caught up. And I'm still waiting on the bloody capacitors. So meanwhile, I completely gutted everything, as we've seen in the previous episodes, and started over. And most of the reinstallation is complete. I installed this really very, very thick turret board. And it's like FR4 fiberglass, so you couldn't break that if you tried, unless you had like tools. So drilled 4 holes to put that in. It mounts from the bottom with those screws. So yes, I'm putting holes in this chassis. Oh my God, it was original. Look, hey, look at the condition of this thing, okay? We've preserved the original paint and the original rust by clear coating over it. But let's not pretend that this was a pristine chassis, that this was ever going to be a museum piece. Drilling holes in it in order to replace, I mean, this was the original turret. I mean, this is the original strip here. You know, it was a 1-row strip, and all the caps were going from the strip directly to the pots and flapping around, and yeah, it just is what a mess it was, you know. So we got the new circuit board in there, and we got most of the new resistors. These were some old stock 10K power resistors. I think they're like in the 7-watt range, so they'll be more than adequate for the voltage dropping on the power supply. And we've got a pair of 220K resistors that are, let's take a look at the schematic. The 220Ks there are these guys right here on either side of the plates, balancing the plates and powering them, really. So all that's wired up, right? There's a pair of 4.7 megs that I'm missing. I couldn't find those in any of my kits. So there's going to be a pair of 4.7 megs that are going just like these two are. And those will be those ones there at the cathode of the 12AY7 and tied to ground. And all the tying to ground and all of that stuff, moving the light around here, that's all been handled, right? So I have rewired everything. There is no more original wiring in this thing whatsoever. If you're wondering about this colorful, thin wire, it is actually military spec wire. It is silver-plated copper, stranded, and insulated with PTFE, otherwise known as Teflon. Teflon is very, very tough, very, very abrasion resistant, and has a very, very high dielectric strength. And so the insulation can be a lot thinner than it can be on typical PVC wiring. And not only that, but it's a lot more heat resistant, as well as being a lot more abrasion resistant, and it is a lot more chemically stable than PVC and will last a hell of a lot longer. Anyway, with some very rare exceptions, but, you know, within the context of a guitar amp, yeah, this stuff's going to last forever. So all the input jacks have been reinstalled. They were absolutely filthy. In the inside, I used a gun brush to clean them out. This was slightly under gauge, so I kind of had to, you know, auger it around in the hole. But that, in combination with, you know, some gun cleaner, it really cleaned up these jacks perfect. Let's see if I can get the light on it just right. Oh, my finger. And now let's see if I can make the thing focus. Yeah, that's kind of getting the idea. Anyway, it's shiny and reflective inside those jacks now, as opposed to dull and dirty and full of hair and crap before. Really nice. That's all cleaned up. Everything's reinstalled. Now, I ran a ground bus, that green wire there. Previously, this thing was largely, except for the instrument number 1 and the microphone number 1, was depending on the chassis ground. And I think, you know, with the combination of paint and, it, you know, just a brass on steel contact, and then depending on it, I think that they, you know, put it this way. There's an interesting, deliberate grounding thing they did here with this 12AY7 shield, right? This first high gain input tube is electrically isolated from the chassis with these rubber grommets. I proved that with a multimeter in an earlier video, or maybe I didn't prove it with a multimeter, but I proved it with a multimeter to myself. Whether I did that in the video, I can't remember. But anyway, that whole thing and the shield that goes on, electrically isolated from the chassis, right? And it's got its own ground point right there. And, you know, I didn't just make this up on my own. I actually repeated this. But the, you know, the 6SN7 cathode resistor is grounded to there. And so I kind of took that as being something deliberate, whereas I took the lack of grounding on the inputs to be lazy. Like, I think that they were just too lazy to run that thing, and they were like, oh, it's, you know, they screw into the chassis, it's going to ground through the chassis, it's fine. I think that's lazy. It probably led to higher hum than it needed to be. So I've regrounded everything. The pots and the inputs all ground through this point to this point right here. And there are 3 ground points on this turret board. This one, which has a wire running underneath the board, to this ground point here, which is very obviously jumpered to this ground point here. So the main power supply caps, oh, and there's this ground point here as well, which is run to the board. So the 3 power supply caps are going to be here, and that's their ground points. And then the instrument and mic inputs and pots all upstream of that, as well as the balancing resistors down here at the 6V6s. And the other thing I've done is I have dug through my old stock parts, and I found this pair of 5-watt Yageo 100 ohm resistors, and by putting those in series with 2 little terminal strips that I mounted, and they're literally 2 connection terminal strips, I put those in series, and that is our cathode resistor. So if you look at the original schematic, we see that it does in fact call for a 200 ohm cathode resistor there. Now, a lot of amp rebuilders, and myself included, we resort to common values, and I think, what's the common value now? 220, something like that, 250, now 220, but it's never 200. And so you wind up, you wind up running the output tubes a little colder if you up that resistance. So that 200 ohm there is going to run these just as hot as they were originally intended to run. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. Everything is now wired up except for this one ground point here, which is going to get tied in with the it's going to get starred in with the ground from the power cord, and the negative side well, I mean, I guess it is the negative side of the power supply, but it'll also get tied in with the center taps for the power transformer for the high voltage winding and for the filament winding. Yeah, and that should pretty much do it. So power supply caps across here, a couple of 0.047s here, a couple of 0.047s there, a couple of 0.047s there, and then a 0.01 from the bottom leg of this pot to the middle of this one. And yeah, that's pretty much it at that point. Once the transformers are in, obviously you got to wire up the rectifier and got to hook up the power transformer and all that, but that's pretty much ready for those parts. Anyway, that's the update for now. Oh, well, there's one more thing to discuss, the speaker. So I filmed this whole thing about reconing the speaker and did a really, really great job up until the very last step where I used the epoxy that I was given by the recone people, and it had this, and they recommended this epoxy, so I bought it from, and it comes with this little nozzle. And so I assumed that they intended the epoxy to be installed via that nozzle. Well, that was a mistake, because the epoxy, once it starts coming out of that nozzle, boy, it does not stop coming out of that nozzle. And the epoxy got in places where it shouldn't have got on the spider. And I removed a good amount of it, but enough of it remained to kind of pull the spider out of whack and get the voice coil rubbing. So I took it down to the local recone guy, and he should have it for me in a few days. Well, anyway, that is it for now until I get more components.